Okay, today we're going to be working on the 1996 AB1 open-ended question from the AP exam. So here we have the problem. We're given the graph of f prime of x. We'll start off with part A, which reads, for what values of x does f have a relative maximum and why? So remember that we're given the graph of f prime of x here, so we need to do some thinking to get this. We know that a maximum occurs when the slope of a graph goes from positive to negative. So if we look at where the values of f prime of x go from positive to negative, we are looking in this area. So we see that on the interval from -3 to -2, we see that the values of f prime of x are positive. And when we look at -2 to -1, we see that the values are negative. That means from -3 to -2, our slope is going to be positive, and from -2 to -1, our slope is going to be negative. Now our slope changes from positive to negative at the point x equals -2. So according to the first derivative test, this is our relative maximum. Now part B asks for the opposite, the relative minimum, and we know that a minimum occurs when the slope of the graph goes from negative to positive. So if we look at the side of the graph on the interval from 3 to 4, the graph of f prime of x has negative values, which means our slope of f is going to be negative. If we look at 4 to 5, our values are positive, which means our slope will also be positive. So if we go by the same rule, with the first derivative test, we know that x equals 4 is going to be our relative minimum because our slope changes from negative to positive at that point. Part C reads, on what intervals is the graph of f concave upward? Use f prime to justify your answer. So the graph of f is going to be concave up on any interval where the graph of f prime is increasing. So when we look at the graph of f prime here, we see that it is increasing in two places, from -1 to 1, and then from 3 to 5. And since these two areas are increasing, we know that that is where the graph of f will be concave up. And the last part is part D. Suppose that f of 1 equals 0. In the xy plane provided, draw a sketch that shows the general shape of the graph of the function f on the open interval 0 to 2. If we start off looking at the interval from 0 to 1, we know that from part C that f is going to be decreasing and will also be concave up. So here we have our concave up curve, and since these values on f prime of x are negative, we know that our slope here will also be negative. And we're given in the question that f of 1 equals 0, so we have to make sure that this graph passes through that point 1, 0. And we have that right in the middle here. And also, if we look at the graph of f prime of x, we see that the value of at x equals 1 is 0. So our line has to have a horizontal slope at 0, or at 1 rather, which we have here. Now if we move on and we look at the interval from 1 to 2, we see that f prime is decreasing and has negative values. Since it has negative values, we know that the slope needs to be negative once again, so we have our negative slope continuing here. And since it's decreasing, it's going to be the opposite of what we had before, which means it'll be concave down. So here we have our concave down shape. And when we put all this together, we end up with this curve here that goes from concave up to concave down and passes through the point that we're given in the problem. And this is how we do the AB1 question of the 1996 AP exam.